Hi, this is Ben from Tardy Bikes, and due to a couple of customer queries about what to check on your bike before you go for a trials ride and what to check on a new bike during those first few rides, I'm just going to do a quick video showing you the basics of what you need to check on a regular basis on your trials bike. I'm using my bike, which is a Gixxer Variable 1010, obviously slightly different to a street or a stock bike, but the same principles apply. In order to check your bike on those first few rides, you'll just need some very basic tools. For my bike, we've got an 8mm Allen key to check the crank bolt. We've got a 6mm Allen key and a 5mm Allen key. You may well need a 10mm and a 4mm depending on the bolts that your crank uses or your stem uses or any other part on the bike. So make sure you've got the correct tools before you start the job. Multi-tools will do for quick checks whilst you're out on a ride, but ideally proper workshop tools like the ones shown are better because they give you more leverage and more feel when checking how tight bolts and fittings are. So if you've bought a new bike from us, you'll notice that you get a little bit of paperwork that details all the things that you need to check on those first few rides. One of the most important is pedals. During the first few rides of a new bike, the action of riding a trials bike, moving your pedals in this motion when you're on the back wheel and looking to jump across gaps and hops and things like that, can actually loosen the pedals. So it's really important you check them every 10 minutes on those first few rides. And when the bike gets a little bit older, it's good practice to continue those checks. In particular, before you go out for a ride, it's a really good idea to check to make sure your pedals are still tight, as well as a few other things which we'll get to in a moment. So for my pedals, I need to use an 8mm Allen key to tighten these up. Some pedals use a 6mm fitting on the back and some pedals use a 15mm spanner fitting. Some pedals use both. So make sure you've got the correct tool for the job. As you can see here, the tool I'm using is a proper workshop tool. Again, multi-tools are okay to get you out of an emergency situation, but tools like this give you a lot more leverage so you can actually feel how tight you are doing the bolts. Most manufacturers will specify a torque setting. We put that information in because it's required for the manufacturer warranty, but if you don't have a torque wrench, just use a bit of common sense, use the correct tool and you'll be able to feel that you've got the bolt adequately tight. So pedals are also left and right specific, so you can tell this on the pedal normally because they'll have an L or an R printed on the pedal spindle itself that will tell you whether the pedal is left or right. If they don't, if you have a look at the pedal axle, you'll see that the threads go up in one direction or up in another direction. Obviously threads that go up to the right means that this is a right hand thread and therefore goes on the right hand side of the bike. This pedal, the threads go up to the left, so it's a left hand thread and it goes onto the left hand side of the bike. It can get a little bit confusing, but I'm going to show you a really simple way to make sure that you get the right pedal on the right side and that you tighten them up correctly. So starting with the bike facing you like this, so you'll be facing the drive side, we're going to fit the right hand pedal. So remember, that's the one with an R printed on the pedal spindle or with the threads pointing up in that direction when you're looking at the pedal like this. Offer the pedal up to the crank, like that. You literally just need to rest it against the crank. And what I find works best is if you hold the pedal spindle gently and just rotate the cranks back slowly whilst maintaining light pressure, you'll actually feel the thread of the pedal start to engage. You can see it's actually started to thread in there. And then once it's engaged, you'll normally be able to wind the pedal back gently and wind it all the way into the crank, or you can use your tool, whether it's a spanner or an Allen key, and just gently wind it in. If you feel any sort of resistance, any sort of extreme pressure, stop, take the pedal out, because there's a chance you might have put it in at an angle, or there might be a problem with the thread. So don't force it. It should go in quite easily. As you can see now, I'm not really putting any effort into that. You can also see that I'm turning the Allen key towards the front of the bike. So that is that pedal tight. You're tightening it clockwise. So to make sure that it's properly tight now that it's all the way in, I'm going to stand above the bike behind it with the cranks as they are there. I'm going to put my tool into the back of the pedal and just arrange it so I can get a good amount of leverage on the pedal on the Allen key. I'm going to hold on to the crank just to make sure that nothing moves or slips, and I'm just going to give it a really good hard tug. So you can see there I'm actually putting enough force to bend the Allen key. That's how tight they need to be. Don't overdo it because you might end up damaging the tool or it might slip and you might cause yourself an injury. For the left hand side, it's exactly the same. So we're going to face the side of the bike which we're fitting the pedal to. The left hand pedal, remember that's the one with the threads going in this direction, up to the left. We're going to offer it up to the crank and rotate the crank back slowly until the threads engage, like that. Get your tool and just wind that pedal in. Again, you'll notice we're turning this anti-clockwise, which is a little bit counterintuitive because the other one was clockwise. But the thing to remember is you're always tightening the pedal towards the front of the bike when you're facing the side that you're fitting the pedal to. So if we turn that towards the front of the bike until it stops, and then we're going to do exactly the same again. I'm going to come around this side, I'm going to stand behind the bike, put my tool in the back, hold on to the opposite side so I've got a good grasp so nothing slips, and just give it a really good tug. And that's those pedals fitted and tight. So again, you can see I'm just giving it a really good pull just to make sure it's tight. If you do have a torque wrench, brilliant. Stick to the recommended torque settings that the manufacturer gives you. But that is how to check your pedals. So one of the other important bolts to check on a bike that's new and also a bike that gets ridden regularly is the crank bolt. So this is the bolt that holds the cranks on. This uses a splined bottom bracket, but it's exactly the same system for a square taper bottom bracket. The only difference is the actual thread of the bolt is a little bit smaller, but it works in the same way. You might have noticed that I've already removed the bolt from the crank. This doesn't mean the crank is going to fall off on its own as it is. These cranks actually have a slightly tapered fit, so the action of screwing the bolt on presses the crank onto the spindle of the bottom bracket and actually holds it securely. So you can see I can't take that crankset off. If I was to ride it without the bolt, however, it wouldn't be long before it fell off and caused a great deal of damage and injury. So when these bolts go in, again, use the appropriate tool. Most of the time it's an 8mm Allen key, exactly the same one that I use to fit my pedals. Sometimes it's a 10mm, so just make sure you have the correct one and obviously make sure that it's a good fit. You offer that up and screw it in clockwise. If the bolt comes with any washers, make sure they are on first. This is particularly important with bikes that use a splined bottom bracket. So once it's tight, we're going to turn it clockwise. So you can see I'm using a lot of force. I'm bending the Allen key when I tighten that up. Most of these bolts, their recommended torque is anywhere between 40 to 50 Newton meters. Ideal if you have a torque wrench. If you don't, using a proper workshop tool with a good length handle will allow you to get good leverage, and when the bolt is tight and the tool starts to bend, that's a good indication that the bolt is tight enough. Really important to check both sides of the crank as well, so make sure you check them on a regular basis. Ideally, I would do the same as the pedals every 10 minutes if it's a brand new bike. If it's a bike that's been used, make sure you check it before every ride, exactly the same as you would with the pedals. It's worth mentioning, it's a good idea to carry tools like this in your backpack, because if you're doing a big session and you're out for a long time during the day, there's no guarantee that things are going to stay tight, especially if you're having lots of crashes or you're trying to do big moves that mean you're having to jump off or maybe throw the bike. Things can come loose, so just make sure you've got what you need to tighten things up before they become a problem. So one of the last things we're going to cover that's really important to check on a regular basis for new bikes, and again bikes that get ridden a lot, is the wheel bolts. Because, especially with disc brake bikes, the amount of stress that goes through the wheel with jumping about, locking the back brake, these nuts can work themselves loose, these little bolts here. On my bike, it's a 5mm Allen key. Again, I'm using a workshop Allen key, but a multi-tool will do the job just to get you out of a situation. But it's a good idea when you do these checks to use good quality tools. And it's just a case of making sure that they are tight on both sides. Again, it's a normal bolt, so it's clockwise to tighten it up. It's exactly the same for the rear of the bike as well. Most bikes will use a 5mm Allen key to tighten the bolts up on the stem and on the handlebar. Again, it's a really good idea to check these on a regular basis, because if you think the amount of force that's going through the handlebars, particularly if you're landing to front wheel, there's a lot of force that these bolts have to cope with, and they do work themselves loose. So it's good practice just to check and make sure that they are tight. One of the really common issues with brand new bikes is the headset bearings on the first few rides can actually settle in after being subjected to repeated load. So again, landing heavy on the front wheel can put a lot of shock through this, and what happens is the bearings just settle down a little bit and the factory grease that's in the bearing dissipates slightly, which can introduce a small amount of play. You can feel this when you hold the front brake and rock the bike backwards and forwards. It'll make itself known as a little knock. If you put your thumb and forefinger on either side of the headset bearing and rock the bike backwards and forwards, or you can put it against a wall or something solid against the front wheel and just push the bike against it, you'll feel that knocking there. Sometimes you will get a slight amount of movement in the brake pads for a brand new bike, so it will feel like a loose headset, but more often than not, it is actually the brakes. If you want to double check this, put the bike against something solid, put your thumb and forefinger on the headset, and just move the bike against it. Any play in the headset will make itself known. You'll be able to feel it in your thumb and finger. To adjust the headset, you need to undo the two clamping bolts first. So they are loose, so you can see they're not even finger tight. And then the bolt on top is what clamps everything together and preloads the headset. On my bike, it's a 6mm Allen key. On some bikes, it's a 5. On some, it's even smaller than that. So again, just make sure you've got the correct tools. And to adjust that, it's literally just nipped until that play goes away. So you literally just tighten it enough and then check to make sure that that play has disappeared. And once that's done, you then tighten up the two stem bolts evenly. So don't tighten one all the way and then the other all the way. Do a bit of one and a bit of the other until they're tight. Again, I'm using feel, but I've got a nice big Allen key to feel how tight those bolts are. But check with your manufacturer to make sure what the recommended torque settings are, and ideally use a torque wrench if you have one, but if not, just kind of again using a bit of common sense. When the tool starts to flex, that's a good idea that things are getting about as tight as they need to be, and that's all that needs to be done there. That top cap bolt is purely there to preload the bearings. It is not holding the stem on, so don't over tighten that. It's literally about 1 Newton-meter is as tight as that needs to be, so just enough to get rid of the play. And it's really important that these bolts are loose first, because these are the ones that actually clamp the stem to the steerer tube, and if they're not loose, all you're doing is tightening that up. The stem is clamped solid onto the steerer, so nothing is being compressed. So I hope you found that useful. Don't forget, the main thing to take away from this is check your bike on a regular basis. For a brand new bike, if you purchased it from us, make sure you give the documents that you get with the bike a really careful read, because it's got lots of useful information in there about the sort of things you should be checking and the sort of things you should be looking out for on a brand new bike. And for a bike like this that's used and it's had quite a lot of ride time, just make sure you check those regular things. So the pedals, the crank bolts, make sure the wheel bolts are tight, and give all the other nuts and bolts on the bike a regular check, preferably before every ride. And if you're doing a big ride, make sure that you take all the tools with you that you need to make any adjustments. So if anything does come loose, at least then you'll be able to rectify it. And once you've checked everything, it'll be safe to ride.